I generally don't do these kinds of videos on my channel, I don't think. This is kind of gonna be like a writing advice video, but specifically like the writing advice that I feel like the minute that I first encountered this advice improved my writing almost immediately. And I hate being that kind of like author tuber that's just like, this advice is gonna change your life like today, like overnight. Fundamentally, the act of writing, you're not gonna improve overnight. But for me personally, there are specific types of things that I have implemented in my writing where I've seen my writing get better fairly quickly, and I'm gonna do my best to explain these things. I'm not the best, honestly, at giving sort of like broad writing advice type videos because like I write a lot with my gut. I tend to write based on like just how I feel, and I'm not always very good at taking abstract concepts and solidifying them. I thought I would make a video out of this anyway because it's construction. Welcome to the city. The reason that I was kind of prompted to even make this video is because I've been doing a lot of beta reading recently. I've just been reading work from younger or newer writers, and there is like a trend in the feedback that I've been giving, and I was kind of trying to reflect on, you know, what are the concrete things that I keep saying over and over in my critiques, and I think it can be sort of compiled in these tips.
Hey, what's goody? I think you stole my heart, maybe you can steal my hoodie. Right from the
Before we get into the video, I just want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, Teddy Blake. I'm so excited to work with Teddy Blake again. If you don't know, Teddy Blake creates affordable luxury handbags that are designed and made in Italy with quality craftsmanship. For a fraction of the price of high-end designer brands, their handbags come in a range of styles and sizes, and they're always refreshing their collections, so guaranteed they'll have a handbag that fits your style and needs. A few months ago, they sent me this beautiful Kim Stampato 11-inch, and I've absolutely loved having it as part of my everyday handbag rotation. The leather has held up really well with use so far. I've taken this out on rainy days. The other thing to note is that I'm not particularly gentle with my handbag. I need my handbags to be able to withstand wear and tear, and so far I have not been disappointed with this bag. If you're looking to get a new handbag for yourself this season, Teddy Blake is actually having a crazy sale right now. They're having discounts of up to 75%. So now is the perfect time if you are in the market for a new handbag, or if you're just looking to do some gift shopping. And you can click the link in the description box, use my discount code, and you can get a discount off of your next purchase. That is all, and thank you once again to Teddy Blake for sponsoring today's video. So I feel like it's important to state, like before I even get into everything, that I think all of these tips or whatever can more or less be summarized under the umbrella of show don't tell. It can be frustrating to get like a show don't tell type of feedback on a piece of work that is really vague, because in reality I think the show don't tell rule manifests in a lot of different ways. Sometimes I'll write show don't tell on a critique and it has to do with description, or it has to do with characterization, or with character emotion, or with a plot point or a theme. The idea of writing with a little bit more nuance in your prose, that is something that takes shape in a lot of different ways, and it really depends on the kind of story that a specific writer is telling. And so what I've tried to do, I guess, with the tips that I've written down, these are different ways that you can show versus tell in your writing. Okay, so the first one, sure, a lot of people have already heard this, but it has to be stated. If there's literally anything you take away from this video, it has to be this, and that is specificity. Whether it's description, character, emotion, everything. Maybe not on a first draft, but definitely when you're revising. It is extremely important to ask yourself, have I been specific enough in my description? So for example, if you have a character who's saying, I looked out the window at the beautiful view. So this is an example of a show don't tell in a setting description, because you're telling the reader that they're looking at a beautiful view rather than describing what the beautiful view is. So it might say, I looked out the window and the sunset casted warm golden streaks over the water. I think this is like almost the simplest example of what a show don't tell is. It basically comes down to describing for a reader what they're seeing instead of telling them how they should feel about what they're seeing. Another example that I can pull, this is from my own writing. I'm kind of using my own writing for this video just because I know it off the top of my head. I've actually shared this already. I have a whole separate video, a whole separate line editing video that I've done on this excerpt. This is from my YA fantasy. So this is a description of a tavern. And in my first draft, the sentence that I wrote was, "It was raucous tonight." And on the surface, that sentence doesn't seem that bad. Like you're saying, oh yeah, the tavern was raucous. A show don't tell version of that sentence would be instead to describe to the reader, how is the tavern raucous? I basically took out that word entirely. My edit was, "It was filled to the brim with tired sailors, merchants on their breaks, sweat and laughter, holding the walls together." It's really about giving your descriptions the space to breathe. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about is thinking about multiple sensations when building out atmosphere. I think a lot of the time what I see with newer writers is when they're describing something, it's very often focused on the visual. This is what the house looked like. This is what the room looked like. This is what this person looked like. This was their hair color. This was their eye color. And I think one of the things that sort of immediately helped me with my own descriptions was whenever I set out to describe anything, I try to also think about not just what something looks like, but what it smells like, what it feels like, what it sounds like. But the reason I bring it up is because when you start kind of appealing to those other senses, what it allows the reader to do is the reader can more easily feel immersed in the atmosphere because they are experiencing all the sensations the way the character is experiencing it beyond just the visual. Certain descriptions that are only visual doesn't feel as woven seamlessly with the narrative itself. So just to use the same excerpt that I brought up earlier as an example, in my first draft, there was an original line at the end of the scene. The line was just, "Mito gestured at the barkeep for another round." In the first version, there's nothing wrong with this line, but the second version is a little bit easier for the character to feel what the atmosphere is. The next thing I want to talk about is, again, something that is, I think, a simpler fix that, writers can start implementing almost immediately, and that is thinking about stronger verbs. So this is something that my writing teacher, back when I was in university and I took some creative writing workshops, she made us do this exercise where I think she made us take like the first paragraph of whatever our current short story was. We had to highlight every verb and try to think of a stronger one. You might hear this, but the to be verb is usually a weak verb. I still use it quite a bit, but I do agree that a lot of the times it's a very passive verb. But yeah, I do think it's a good practice to think about what kind of verbs you're using and think about how the connotations of certain verbs can change the tone of a sentence. So for example, if you're saying that the person cried, swapping out he cried with he sobbed or he wept or he sniffled, those other words are a lot more specific in what they're describing. And so if you can find the word that creates a more clear or punchier emotion, often strengthen a sentence. Go back to the same excerpt that I was talking about earlier with my YA fantasy. I originally had this line that went, "A heavy-bellied man was singing and strumming a guitar out of tune atop a table." And then I ended up changing the sentence in the line edit to, "A heavy-bellied drunkard swayed atop a center table, armed with a broken lute, wailing some awful sea shanty at the top of his lungs." So what I did was I took out the verb was entirely and I changed it to swayed. The image of a man simply existing atop a table is not as evocative as saying he was swaying. Instead of saying that he just had a guitar, I said he was armed with the instrument, which creates that like stronger, more dramatic, almost comedic tone to it. And instead of saying he was singing, he was wailing. So that's an example of just like when you think about your verbs and you change them, they can fundamentally change the tone and feeling of your sentences. Next is dialogue. There are a couple things that I want to say about dialogue, and the first one is on subtext and flow. Like if you're struggling with dialogue specifically, and it's like, how do I write dialogue? How do I make it sound natural? How do I make the characters express what they're, feeling, but not having them necessarily state their feelings? My sort of guiding principle with dialogue is sometimes, not always, because it depends on the character, sometimes have that character talk around their feelings rather than stating their feelings. Okay, sorry for this lighting change. The construction was getting so loud that I physically couldn't continue. It's a fine line because I don't believe that good dialogue in prose it should sound the way that people actually talk in real life. I don't think that's true, because if you actually listen to the way that people talk in real life, it's rambly, it's all over the place. It wouldn't make for fun reading. This isn't true for all characters. However, I do think there's this tendency where characters will often just say exactly what they're thinking or exactly what they need to move the plot along, and it's very obvious that it's kind of like when the character is talking, you're not seeing the character, you're seeing the writer. When I started really thinking about like what it means to have engaging dialogue, it's about thinking about what this character's personality is, what they want, what they are afraid to talk about, and the dialogue is about finding that sort of in between. On the topic of dialogue, less dialogue tags, just cut them out. Newer writers will often find a bunch of different synonyms to say he said, and I think the synonyms are good every once in a while. I do think that you can't just completely cut out dialogue tags, and they do serve their purpose, but I think you can use them a lot more sparingly than you realize. Take out a dialogue tag in exchange for an action indicator or a description. A lot of the times the sentence becomes stronger. I think I was watching like one of Brandon Sanderson's lectures where he said that like words like he said, especially the word said, almost like invisible to the reader. And so they're really only there to indicate who is speaking. But in a dialogue exchange where it's very clear who is speaking, you might not even like need to have that dialogue tag. Let's say this was the phrase, "You're wrong," he said, frowning. "I bet I could beat you." Instead, you could say, "You're wrong. His hand twitched around his knife. I bet I could beat you." The latter is a stronger indicator of the tension that might be in the scene. And so I've kind of gotten into this habit of building out atmosphere by swapping dialogue tags for descriptions. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is emotion and minimize labeling emotions. This is not a hard and fast rule. I don't think it's like true that you have to completely cut out saying that someone feels happy, sad, angry, etc., or frustrated, irritated. It has a time and place. However, I do think what I was saying earlier about specificity, it is a lot more productive and immersive for a reader to just show how a character would act if they were happy or sad or angry. But I do think that it's worth swapping some of those labeled emotions for instead saying, if he's irritated, like how does that actually manifest in how he feels? You might say, he pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed. There are ways to indicate how a character is feeling through their actions, how their body is actually reacting to the emotion. Okay, this one is going to be something that I feel like I do a lot. Take this with a grain of salt, but if you're struggling with exposition, consider putting your exposition in an anecdote. This works, I think, for both world building exposition or character background exposition. I write a lot of sci-fi fantasy, so sometimes you're introducing, antagonistic characters who are literally scary murderer people. Instead of having your character say to another character, "Watch out for so-and-so, she's deadly, she's killed a lot of people." A lot of the times what I'll do is I'll package exposition into an anecdote. So I might integrate it naturally into a conversation that two characters are having, where one character will be like, "I did meet that person. I did a job for her. I watched her rip clean through a man's skull with her bare hand, and she didn't even blink." The anecdote could be a lot more interesting and longer and more evocative than that. But that's usually what I'll do with like character exposition. I'll just like turn it into some kind of anecdotal story that a character can tell that can integrate more naturally or seamlessly into a scene because it's just dialogue. The last thing I want to talk about, and this is going to be very, abstract, and I think that this will mean different things to different people, but it is the concept of theme. I think that this has become one of the most important things that informs my process. And this is part of my personal taste when I'm also reading other stories, is I always go into any piece of media wanting to know, what is this story ultimately trying to say? I think that's the powerful thing about theme, is that it gives the story a sense of purpose. Like you get to the end of the story and it's like, why was this story written? Why did they go out of the way to tell this story? I personally see theme as a guiding compass to my stories. For example, this is like a short story that I wrote like last year. I want to write a story about a teenager who's going off to university soon and is kind of afraid of what the future has in store for her. She's using this last high school party to try to forget those insecurities and fears that she's feeling. That is a character conflict, and that is the plot. And so the theme of the story has to be on anxiety and fear of the future. I like to know that almost immediately because I use that as an anchor for the entire story. So I think that this is something that's not necessarily like important that every writer views theme in this way, but I think, for example, if you're writing a story and you're struggling to find out how to end it, or you don't know where you want the story to go, knowing what your core theme is and really doing some time to brainstorm, what am I ultimately trying to say? Brainstorming theme has always helped me find the right ending. I hope that was helpful for any of you. If you have any writing advice, tips that have like concretely changed, your writing style, and you've seen like tangible improvements from it, I would love to know, because I'm always trying to think about ways to sort of challenge how I view my own writing and how I view craft in general, and trying to be kind of like open to how different people view the storytelling process, because I do think it's very different depending on what kind of writer you are. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
But I feel alive. I send a text to some girl online. I think this on my chest, she been on my mind. Think we can get it right.